Across the United States come out murderers, fugitives, unrepentant killers, and hardened criminals. Men and women whose actions shattered families and changed communities forever. Since 1927, more than 1,500 executions have been carried out across the country, each one marking the end of a long and brutal journey through the American justice system. And today, The Last Verdict examines 7 of the most notorious individuals connected to the death penalty. Some already executed, others still waiting for the state to decide the exact day, hour, and minute their sentence will be carried out. Before we dive in, viewer discretion is strongly advised. If you support the work we do here at The Last Verdict, make sure to subscribe, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, and help us spread awareness by liking and sharing this video. Now, let's begin. Case 1. Barbara Graham. Mabel Monahan had spent 63 years building a quiet life, and it ended violently on a Tuesday evening. The former vaudeville performer lived alone in her modest Burbank bungalow at 1718 Parkside Avenue, her stage days long behind her. On March 9, 1953, she had no reason to fear the knock at her door. Criminals whispered that Mabel kept a fortune hidden somewhere in her home, gambling winnings from her late husband's Las Vegas connections. They were fatally wrong. When police found her body the next morning, the scene told a horrific story. Mabel had been beaten repeatedly, her skull fractured from savage blows. A pillow pressed against her face had suffocated her final breaths. The killers had torn through every room, overturning furniture and emptying drawers in a frantic search. Their reward for murdering an elderly woman? Less than $100 in some worthless costume jewelry. Barbara Graham was 29 years old and running out of options. Born to a prostitute mother who served time in San Quentin, Barbara had spent her childhood shuffled between reform schools and foster homes, learning early that survival meant manipulation and charm. By 1953, she had become everything society feared: a prostitute, a con artist, a drug addict, and an abandoned mother whose 3 children barely knew her. Her striking looks, dark curls and luminous eyes, had opened doors, but her moral compass had long since shattered. The plan was deceptively simple. Criminal associates Jack Santo and Emmett Perkins had heard about Mabel Monahan's supposed fortune and recruited Barbara for a specific role. An elderly widow wouldn't open her door late at night for 3 strange men, but she might open it for a young woman in distress, a damsel claiming car trouble or asking for directions. Barbara would be the key that unlocked Mabel's door and sealed her fate. That March evening, Barbara knocked and played her part perfectly. When Mabel opened the door with concern on her face, Barbara pushed inside, followed immediately by Santo and Perkins. They bound the terrified woman and demanded she reveal where she kept the money. When Mabel insisted no fortune existed, frustration turned to fury. The prosecution would later argue that Barbara, high on drugs and enraged at finding nothing valuable, participated actively in the torture. Witnesses claimed she delivered some of the blows herself, though Barbara would dispute this until her final breath. What remained undisputed was this: Barbara Graham was present when an innocent woman was beaten to death for pocket change, and she did nothing to stop it. The investigation moved swiftly. On March 26, 1953, just 17 days after the murder, police arrested Barbara Graham along with Santo and Perkins. Detectives employed a controversial tactic that would haunt the case for decades. They used an undercover officer who posed as a criminal willing to provide Barbara with a false alibi for $25,000. Barbara, desperate and recorded without her knowledge, eagerly discussed details of the crime and how the fake alibi would need to account for her whereabouts. The tapes captured her admitting presence at Mabel's house, though she continued minimizing her role in the actual violence. The trial that began in August 1953 became less about justice and more about spectacle. Newspapers dubbed Barbara Bloody Babs, and coverage obsessively emphasized her past as a prostitute and her failures as a mother. Details that had nothing to do with Mabel Monahan's murder, but painted Barbara as morally corrupt. The prosecution built their case on California's felony murder rule. Even if Barbara hadn't personally delivered the fatal blows, her participation in the robbery that resulted in death made her equally culpable as the men who had. Barbara made the calculated decision to testify, a gamble that backfired catastrophically. On the stand, she admitted being present during the robbery but denied killing Mabel, claiming drug-induced memory gaps for specific details. Her testimony came across as rehearsed and emotionally hollow. She showed no genuine remorse, no tears for the woman who had died. The jury saw coldness where they expected contrition. On September 22, 1953, after hours of deliberation, the verdict came. Guilty of first-degree murder for all three defendants, with a recommendation of death. Judge Charles Frick looked directly at Barbara as he pronounced sentence. "Mrs. Graham, you showed no mercy to Mrs. Monahan, and the law can show you none." Barbara Graham spent the next 20 months on death row at Corona State Prison for Women, filing appeal after appeal, each one denied. She became a media obsession. Journalists wrote about her maintaining beauty routines in her cell, reading law books, occasionally breaking down, but more often displaying hard defiance. June 3, 1955, was supposed to be the end, but California put Barbara through one final torture. Her execution was delayed multiple times that day due to last-minute appeals, each delay offering false hope before crushing it again. Finally, that afternoon, guards led her into San Quentin's gas chamber. She had requested that reporters be denied permission to witness her death, telling the warden she didn't want to be stared at like an animal in a zoo. The request was denied, strapped into the chair with a stethoscope attached to her chest so doctors could monitor her dying. Barbara Graham spoke her final words. "Good people are always so sure they're right." Minutes later, cyanide pellets dropped into acid beneath her. She died by asphyxiation at age 32, taking approximately 5 minutes to lose consciousness. 3 years later, the film I Want to Live, starring Susan Hayward, brought Barbara's story back to national attention, winning an Academy Award and presenting her as a flawed woman railroaded by an unjust system. The film sparked debate that continues 70 years later. Was Barbara Graham sentenced more harshly because she was a woman who had violated every expectation of femininity? Did she deserve execution for participating in a robbery murder, or was death disproportionate to her actual role? Did the media circus and her past as a prostitute prejudice the jury beyond any possibility of fairness? Barbara Graham remains a symbol for death penalty abolitionists, her case cited as potential evidence that the state sometimes executes people as much for who they are as for what they did. The question haunts us still. Did justice prevail in that gas chamber? Or did California kill a woman because good people were too sure they were right? Case 2. Michael James Perry. Sandra Stotler was doing what she loved on the afternoon of October 24, 2001, baking cookies in her Conroe, Texas home, filling the kitchen with the sweet scent of vanilla and chocolate chips. At 50 years old, she had built a comfortable life in the quiet Houston suburb, a safe haven where she raised her children and welcomed their friends as her own. Her son Adam, 16, was home that Thursday, a bright teenager with his whole future ahead of him. Jeremy Richardson, 18, was there too, a family friend so close he was practically another son, the kind of kid who showed up for dinner and stayed to help with dishes. None of them could have imagined that their lives would end that day over something as trivial as a car. By the time authorities found their bodies 3 days later in a lake, dumped like trash, the senselessness of their murders would shock even hardened investigators. Sandra had been shot for her car keys. Adam and Jeremy had been shot to eliminate witnesses. 3 lives extinguished in minutes, all because 2 young men wanted to take a joyride in Sandra's red Camaro. Michael James Perry was 19 years old, legally an adult but barely removed from adolescence, when he and his friend Jason Burkett decided they wanted Sandra Stotler's car. Not needed it, wanted it. There was no desperate escape from danger, no grand criminal enterprise requiring a getaway vehicle. They simply saw a red Camaro and decided it should be theirs for cruising around town, impressing girls, living out some dim-witted fantasy of being tough guys. The plan, if it could even be called that, was staggeringly stupid and brutally executed. Perry and Burkett went to Sandra's home that October afternoon. When Sandra answered the door, they didn't just take the keys. They shot her dead in her own kitchen, her cookies still cooling on the counter. The gunshot brought Adam running, and they shot him too. Jeremy, witnessing the horror, became the 3rd victim. Bang, bang, bang. 3 murders in the time it takes to brew coffee. What followed was almost comedic in its incompetence, if it weren't so tragic. Perry and Burkett loaded the bodies into Sandra's vehicle, drove to a lake, and dumped them in the water. Then they drove around Conroe in the stolen Camaro, showing it off, bragging about their new ride. They were arrested within days, found in possession of the car along with items belonging to all three victims. The evidence was overwhelming. Ballistics matched the murder weapon to guns they possessed. Witnesses placed them at the scene, and they had literally been caught red-handed with the stolen vehicle. During police interrogation, Perry displayed a chilling indifference that would haunt the case. He showed no genuine remorse for the 3 lives he'd taken, but no horror at what he'd done. Instead, he was preoccupied with his image, concerned about how he looked to others, maintaining denials that flew in the face of irrefutable evidence. It was as if the murders were an inconvenience to his self-perception, rather than a moral catastrophe. When pressed about Sandra baking cookies, about Adam being just 16, about Jeremy's family waiting for him to come home, Perry offered nothing but hollow deflections. The randomness of the violence disturbed investigators most. This wasn't a crime of passion, wasn't revenge or a drug deal gone wrong. It was simply 2 young men who wanted something and were willing to kill anyone who stood between them and it. The banality of the motive, a joyride, made the brutality somehow more horrifying. Michael Perry's trial in 2003 was never really in doubt. The prosecution presented a case so airtight that the defense had almost nothing to work with. Ballistics evidence conclusively matched the murder weapon. Multiple witnesses placed Perry at Sandra's home. He'd been caught driving the stolen Camaro with the victim's possessions. Security footage, phone records, and forensic evidence all pointed to the same conclusion. Michael Perry had participated in a triple homicide. Perry was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. Jason Burkett, equally culpable in the planning and execution of the crime, received life imprisonment. Both had been there. Both had participated. Both had shown equal disregard for human life. Yet one would die while the other would eventually have the possibility of parole. This disparity raised uncomfortable questions about the arbitrary nature of capital punishment. What made Perry deserve death while Burkett deserved life? Prosecutors argued Perry had been the shooter, but in a crime where both defendants were active participants, did pulling the trigger versus handing over the gun really warrant such different outcomes? Perry's youth at the time of the crime, 19 years old, was noted but ultimately dismissed as a mitigating factor. The Supreme Court wouldn't ban executions for defendants under 18 until 2005, 2 years after Perry's sentencing. Throughout his trial, and the years of appeals that followed, Perry maintained his innocence despite the mountain of evidence against him. It wasn't a claim that sparked serious doubt. The facts were too clear, but it did reveal something about Perry's psychology. He seemed incapable of accepting responsibility, locked in a delusion that denial could somehow override reality. On July 1, 2010, nearly 9 years after he murdered 3 people for a car, Michael James Perry was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas. He was 28 years old, still young, but he'd outlived Adam Stotler by 12 years and Jeremy Richardson by 10. Perry's final statement was as jarring as everything else about the case. Strapped to the gurney with the lethal chemicals about to flow, he sang a gospel song and proclaimed he'd found Jesus Christ. "I'm sorry for what I done," he said, his words captured for the record. Then he added something that seemed almost obscene given the circumstances. "Life don't get much better than this." Moments later, the drugs began their work, and Michael Perry stopped breathing. His execution became the centerpiece of Werner Herzog's 2011 documentary, Into the Abyss, a profound meditation on capital punishment, violence, and the American criminal justice system. Herzog interviewed Perry on death row just days before his execution, capturing a young man who seemed almost childlike in his inability to grasp the magnitude of what he'd done. The film also featured Jason Burkett, serving his life sentence, and the victims' family members, some of whom supported the death penalty, others who questioned whether any execution could truly bring closure. The documentary revealed the fault lines that Perry's case exposed. Sandra Stotler's family remained divided. Some found a measure of peace in Perry's execution, a sense that justice had finally been served after 9 years of waiting. Others felt empty afterward, realizing that Perry's death didn't bring Sandra, Adam, or Jeremy back. The execution hadn't erased their grief or answered the question that haunted them. Why? Why had their loved ones died for something so meaningless? Into the Abyss forced viewers to confront uncomfortable truths about capital punishment. Perry was unquestionably guilty. He'd participated in a horrific crime with no justification. Yet watching him in his final days, immature, damaged, trying to find meaning in religion as death approached, raised questions about whether killing him served any purpose beyond vengeance. Did executing a man for murders he committed as a teenager make society safer? Did it honor the victims or just create another death? The case continues to be cited in debates about the death penalty's randomness. Why did Perry die while Burkett lived? Why do some killers get executed while others with similar crimes get life? The answers seem to have less to do with justice and more to do with location, legal representation, jury composition, and sheer chance, the arbitrary factors that determine who lives and who dies in America's capital punishment system. Case 3. John Williams. Cecilia Cece Griffin was a 24-year-old convenience store clerk working the late shift in North Little Rock, Arkansas. On the night of October 4, 1997, she was behind the counter when a man entered the store demanding money from the register. For just $200, Cece's life was taken in a single instant. She was shot in the face at point-blank range, the .380 caliber round killing her instantly before she could even react. Security cameras captured the entire encounter, including the shooter fleeing on foot. Cece never made it home that night, and her family's life was shattered in seconds. The killer was John Williams, a 35-year-old man with a long history of drug addiction, petty theft, and violent offenses. Williams had cycled in and out of the criminal system for most of his adult life, with arrests for burglary, assault, and drug possession stacking up behind him. On that October night, he claimed he needed money to fuel his addiction, and Cece Griffin became the obstacle standing between him and another fix. After the shooting, Williams fled the store, unaware that the security cameras had recorded every second of the crime. He was arrested within hours after witnesses identified him leaving the area. During interrogation, he confessed to the shooting with little hesitation, offering no real remorse. He spoke more about his drug problem than the life he had taken, framing the murder as a desperate act without taking responsibility for the brutality of what he had done. Williams was convicted of capital murder in 1998, and given the overwhelming evidence, his confession, the surveillance footage, and eyewitness accounts, the jury recommended the death penalty. He was sent to Arkansas death row, where he spent the next 19 years exhausting a long chain of appeals. None of the claims raised by his lawyers, drug abuse, impaired judgment, or childhood trauma, convinced the courts to overturn the sentence. His case was considered one of the more straightforward death penalty convictions in Arkansas. Clear motive, clear evidence, and a clear confession. In April 2017, Arkansas found itself at the center of a national firestorm when Governor Asa Hutchinson approved an unprecedented execution schedule. The state planned to execute 8 inmates in just 11 days, because its supply of lethal injection drugs was about to expire. The decision sparked immediate outrage. Critics called it assembly line justice, arguing that rushing executions to beat a pharmaceutical deadline was both unethical and legally reckless. Lawsuits rapidly emerged, claiming that the compressed timeline created a high risk of mistakes and denied inmates adequate time for final appeals. On April 24, 2017, John Williams became one of the men scheduled for execution during this spree. His case, once a tragic but relatively quiet episode in Arkansas's criminal history, was suddenly swept into the national debate about drug shortages, ethics, and the machinery of death. His execution went forward as planned, even as protests continued outside the prison gates. For many, his death became symbolic, not only of the crime he committed, but of the broader question haunting the justice system. Should the expiration date on a vial of chemicals determine when a human life ends? Cece Griffin's family expressed relief that the long process had finally concluded. But the massive controversy surrounding the execution spree overshadowed their daughter's story, leaving some to wonder whether justice for Cece had been honored or simply lost in the chaos of a system racing against time. Case 4. Alan Eugene Miller. On the morning of August 5, 1999, 3 Alabama men began their day unaware it would be their last. At a Pelham Heating and Air Conditioning Company, co-workers Lee Holdbrooks and Christopher Scott Yancey were working their usual shift when a former colleague walked in carrying a gun. Within minutes, both men were shot multiple times at close range, killed instantly. Not long after, former supervisor Terry Lee Jarvis was gunned down at a second location in nearby Birmingham. The attacks were sudden, brutal, and left all three victims dead within hours. Their families and community were devastated by the senseless workplace carnage. The shooter was Alan Eugene Miller, a 34-year-old installer known for his quiet demeanor and growing paranoia. Co-workers later testified that Miller believed people were talking about him behind his back and spreading rumors that he was mentally unstable. On the morning of the murders, he entered his former workplace armed with a handgun and walked straight toward Holdbrooks and Yancey. He opened fire without warning, shooting each man repeatedly. Both died instantly. Miller then drove to another business and confronted his former supervisor, Terry Jarvis, whom he blamed for his employment troubles. Jarvis was shot and killed in front of witnesses. Miller fled the scene, but was quickly apprehended after multiple people identified him and his vehicle. During police interviews, he admitted killing all three men, justifying his actions by claiming they had ruined his life through gossip and workplace humiliation. His confession removed any doubt about his role in the murders. Miller was convicted of capital murder in 2000. Despite testimony about his mental instability and paranoid delusions, the jury unanimously recommended a death sentence, believing he fully understood his actions. He was sent to Alabama's death row at Holman Correctional Facility, where he remained for more than 2 decades. In 2022, Alabama attempted to execute Miller by lethal injection, but the procedure became one of the most disturbing botched executions in recent memory. Prison officials repeatedly failed to establish a viable IV line, poking him multiple times as the execution window expired. Miller stated afterward that he was left bruised, terrified, and unsure if he would survive the ordeal. His legal team filed immediate appeals, arguing the failed attempt constituted cruel and unusual punishment under the Eighth Amendment. A secondary controversy followed when the state claimed that Miller had not properly opted for nitrogen hypoxia, a newly approved execution method, while Miller insisted he had filed the paperwork and the state had lost it. On September 26, 2024, after years of legal battles and procedural chaos, Miller was executed using nitrogen hypoxia, becoming one of the first individuals in American history to die by the method. The procedure involved fitting a mask over his face and replacing breathable oxygen with pure nitrogen, causing death by oxygen deprivation. The execution drew significant controversy. Medical experts warned that the process could cause suffocation-like sensations, panic, and extreme suffering. Some witnesses reported that Miller shook and gasped before falling still. For Alabama officials, the execution represented a new phase in capital punishment, an alternative to lethal injection amid national drug shortages. For death penalty opponents, Miller's case became a disturbing symbol of an experimental, untested method used on a human being. The victims' families had waited 25 years for the sentence to be carried out, but many expressed frustration that the long delays and controversies had overshadowed the tragedy that started it all. Miller's execution raised profound questions about the future of the death penalty, the ethics of experimental methods, and whether any form of state killing can truly be called humane. Case 5. Dzhokhar Tsarnaev. April 15, 2013, started as a celebration. Thousands lined the streets of Boston for the annual marathon, cheering runners to the finish line. In an instant, joy turned to horror. 3 lives were violently stolen. Martin Richard, just 8 years old, waving a sign for the runners. Crystal Campbell, 29, caught in the blast. Lingzi Liu, 23, an international student chasing her dreams. The twin pressure cooker bombs detonated, tearing through the crowd. Over 280 people were injured, including 17 who lost limbs. MIT police officer Sean Collier, unrelated to the race, was shot and killed days later in the ensuing manhunt. The city, paralyzed with fear, grappled with chaos and shock. Ordinary lives were shattered in an attack designed to terrorize a nation. The architects of this carnage were brothers Dzhokhar, 19, and Tamerlan, 26, Tsarnaev. Chechen immigrants radicalized online. They meticulously built pressure cooker bombs in their Cambridge apartment. The devices were packed with shrapnel to maximize casualties. On race day, they placed the bombs near the finish line, knowing civilians would be crowded and vulnerable. Tamerlan was killed in a shootout with police during the immediate pursuit. Dzhokhar fled, hiding in a small boat in a Watertown backyard. Inside, authorities found a handwritten note claiming the attack was retaliation for U.S. military actions abroad. Text messages and social media posts revealed the chilling clarity of their extremist ideology. Dzhokhar, captured alive, immediately became the face of national outrage and the embodiment of a new generation of domestic terrorism. Dzhokhar Tsarnaev's trial, beginning in May 2015, became a focal point for national debate on terrorism, youth, and justice. Convicted on 30 counts, including the use of a weapon of mass destruction, the prosecution emphasized the meticulous planning and unrepentant nature of his actions. The defense argued that Tamerlan, the older brother, was the ringleader, and that Dzhokhar had been influenced and coerced. Heart-wrenching victim impact statements flooded the courtroom, with some, like Martin Richards' parents, asking prosecutors not to seek the death penalty. Yet, the jury ultimately recommended death. The case became a federal test of capital punishment in terrorism, examining whether ideological crimes could justify the ultimate punishment, even when youth and family influence complicated the narrative. As of 2025, Dzhokhar remains on federal death row at the ADX Supermax in Colorado. Appeals have complicated the timeline. A 2020 court vacated his death sentence, but the Supreme Court reinstated it in 2022. His execution date is not yet set. The case continues to polarize the public. Some demand execution as justice for the innocent victims. Others argue life imprisonment suffices, noting Dzhokhar's youth and the influence of his radicalized older brother. It also raises broader questions about federal versus state capital punishment, radicalization, and whether executing terrorists serves justice or merely fuels a cycle of notoriety. Families of victims remain split in opinion, reflecting the tension between vengeance, closure, and the long shadow of tragedy. Case 6. Robert Bowers. On October 27, 2018, the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh became the site of one of the deadliest anti-Semitic attacks in U.S. history. 11 worshippers were murdered during Shabbat services, their lives violently cut short in a place meant for peace and prayer. Among the victims were 97-year-old Rose Mallinger, a lifelong member of the congregation, and 54-year-old Richard Gottfried. 6 others were injured, including 4 police officers who arrived to protect the community. Families, some with Holocaust survivor relatives, were devastated. The attack shook not only Pittsburgh, but the nation, highlighting the vulnerability of religious communities and the lethal consequences of hate. The sanctuary of faith had been transformed into a scene of unimaginable terror, leaving an enduring scar on the community. Robert Bowers, 46, a self-proclaimed white nationalist, carried out the attack. His social media history was filled with anti-Semitic posts, including statements targeting Jewish immigration charities. Minutes before entering the synagogue, he wrote online, "Hayes likes to bring invaders in that kill our people. I can't sit by and watch my people get slaughtered. Screw your optics. I'm going in." Armed with an AR-15 rifle and multiple handguns, Bowers methodically hunted worshippers, shouting, "All these Jews need to die." He engaged in a shootout with responding officers before surrendering, wounded but alive. Investigators described his actions as premeditated and ideologically motivated. The attack was a hate crime of extraordinary scale, exposing the lethal convergence of online radicalization and extremist ideology. Bowers' trial culminated in June 2023 with convictions on 63 counts, including hate crimes and murder. In August 2023, a federal jury sentenced him to death. Throughout the proceedings, Bowers displayed no remorse, reinforcing the prosecution's narrative of a cold, ideologically driven killer. Defense arguments focused on mental illness and broader opposition to the death penalty, while prosecutors emphasized the meticulous planning, the scale of carnage, and the victim's suffering. Victim impact statements were harrowing, with some families advocating for execution and others opposing it on religious grounds, reflecting Jewish law's traditional stance against capital punishment. The case underscored the federal government's approach to prosecuting hate crimes and mass shootings, while also highlighting the ethical and moral debates surrounding the use of the death penalty in such contexts. As of 2025, Robert Bowers remains on federal death row, awaiting execution. No date has been set, and the uncertain future of the federal death penalty adds to the case's complexity. Beyond legal proceedings, the massacre ignited national discussions about online radicalization, domestic terrorism, and anti-Semitism in America. The Pittsburgh Jewish community continues to grapple with trauma, mourning the lives lost while advocating for vigilance and prevention. Scholars and policymakers debate whether execution serves justice or risks granting notoriety to extremists. Bauer's case exemplifies the intersection of terrorism, hate crimes, and capital punishment, raising enduring questions about the effectiveness, morality, and societal consequences of the death penalty in ideologically motivated mass killings. Case 7. Markeith Lloyd. On December 13, 2016, tragedy struck Orlando, Florida, when Sade Dixon, 24, a pregnant woman, was shot 7 times outside her brother's home. She was 9 months along, carrying the child of her ex-boyfriend, Markeith Lloyd. Her death was swift and brutal. The unborn child also perished. The violence did not end there. On January 9, 2017, Lieutenant Deborah Clayton, a 17-year veteran of the Orlando Police Department and mother of 2, was shot and killed outside a Walmart while attempting to arrest Lloyd during the massive manhunt that followed. In addition, Deputy Norman Lewis died in a motorcycle crash during pursuit efforts, bringing the total fatalities connected to Lloyd's spree to 3. The community was paralyzed, and families were left grappling with shock, grief, and questions of justice. Markeith Lloyd, 41, had a long history of criminal behavior, including domestic violence. Following a bitter breakup with Sade Dixon over her pregnancy, Lloyd confronted her outside her brother's home and executed a cold-blooded attack, shooting her multiple times, including in the head as she lay dying. After the murder, he disappeared for 3 weeks, evading authorities while Orlando launched one of the largest manhunts in the city's history. Lloyd's path of violence continued when he encountered Lieutenant Deborah Clayton at a Walmart. He shot her multiple times before fleeing again. During his eventual arrest on January 17, 2017, Lloyd was wearing body armor and resisted law enforcement, sustaining injuries, including an eye injury that required him to appear in court with a patch. His calculated and confrontational behavior reflected both premeditation and a total disregard for human life. In October 2019, Lloyd was convicted of murdering Lieutenant Deborah Clayton, with the jury unanimously recommending the death penalty. In March 2021, he was convicted of murdering Sade Dixon and her unborn child, earning a second death sentence. Throughout both trials, Lloyd displayed no remorse, often smirking and engaging in outbursts, antagonizing the victims' families. The prosecution emphasized the heinousness of the crimes: premeditation, targeting a pregnant ex-girlfriend, and murdering a law enforcement officer. The defense attempted to argue mental illness and a traumatic upbringing, but the court found these factors insufficient to mitigate his culpability. Judges and prosecutors underscored the cruelty and calculated nature of the murders, framing Lloyd as a continuing threat and a clear candidate for the ultimate penalty. As of 2025, Markeith Lloyd remains on Florida's death row, with no execution date set. The appeals process is ongoing, and his case continues to stir controversy, particularly regarding his treatment during arrest, when he was beaten by police and sustained an eye injury. Questions linger about excessive force versus justice for the killing of a veteran officer. Law enforcement advocates strongly support the death penalty in this case, citing the premeditated murders and the impact on public safety. Families of the victims remain deeply traumatized, attending court proceedings and seeking justice. Lloyd's crimes highlight the deadly escalation of domestic violence, the vulnerabilities of women and law enforcement officers, and the broader ethical and legal challenges of the death penalty system. Orlando's community remains scarred, their sense of safety forever altered. 7 cases, 7 lives, 7 deaths, each a story of tragedy, violence, and the ultimate exercise of state power. From Barbara Graham in 1955 to Markeith Lloyd in 2017, these cases span decades of American capital punishment, revealing the complex human, legal, and moral dimensions behind each execution. They remind us that behind every statistic is a person, a family, and a community forever changed. Across these stories, common threads emerge. Innocent lives are shattered, whether by robbery, workplace violence, terrorism, hate crimes, or domestic disputes. The arbitrariness of the death penalty becomes evident. Why does one killer face execution swiftly, while another lingers decades on death row? Gender, race, youth, and mental health influence sentencing in ways that often seem inconsistent. Families of victims are torn between the desire for closure and the recognition that execution may not heal grief. The execution methods themselves, from gas chambers to lethal injection and experimental nitrogen gas, raise further questions. Botched procedures, rushed sprees like Arkansas in 2017, and the influence of logistics over justice expose a system fraught with errors and moral ambiguity. Cases like Alan Miller and John Williams reveal the tension between human rights and administrative efficiency, while Dzhokhar Tsarnaev and Robert Bowers highlight the intersection of ideology, terror, and capital punishment. Ultimately, these 7 cases force us to confront the question: what is justice? Is it revenge, deterrence, or closure? The death penalty, in practice, rarely offers simple answers. It exposes societal contradictions, tests ethical boundaries, and challenges our understanding of fairness. For the victims, the lives lost, the families shattered, and the communities scarred, the weight of tragedy is permanent. For the convicted, the state's ultimate punishment becomes both a moral and procedural battleground. And for society, these stories are a mirror, reflecting our values, our fears, and our capacity for both justice and cruelty. As we leave these stories behind, the questions remain. Do executions serve as justice or perpetuate more death? How much are our decisions about life and death influenced by bureaucracy, ideology, or fear? The answers are not simple, but the conversation, the reflection, and the awareness they inspire are essential. The chamber doors close, the gavel falls, the needle is administered. But the questions outlive every execution, haunting our collective conscience long after the condemned are gone.